Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're incredibly excited to be launching the Pawson Report, a blueprint to tackle Queensland's housing crisis. Thank you for joining us. I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm here on the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands you might be meeting us from today, and that extends across the country. I pay my deep respects to the traditional owners as well as any First Nations people joining us online. QCOSS is really excited this year to be supporting the Yes campaign to make sure that we have a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Australian Constitution. So as I say, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Joining me today for an in-conversation is Professor Hal Pawson from the University of New South Wales and his colleagues as well. And I have suddenly lost my place. Sorry. And his colleagues Andrew Clark and Ryan Van Newland. It's wonderful to have them here. We are incredibly excited to be launching the Pawson Report. It has been months of incredibly hard work from Hal and his team, and it came about because QCOSS, together with our Town of Nowhere partners, which is 16 community organisations across Queensland who are really concerned about the housing crisis, together with our partners, Tenants Queensland and the Services Union, commissioned this report from the University of New South Wales because for years now, our workers have been saying that what they're seeing every day across Queensland, families living in cars, tents and hotel rooms, is not business as usual. We wanted to understand the scale of this crisis. We wanted to understand whether the current policy and investment put up by the Commonwealth and state government meets us in this moment. And we wanted to understand whether there was more that could be done. And so today, I'm delighted that we have Hal and his colleagues here today to talk to us about the Pawson Report. So by way of introduction, Hal Pawson is a Professor of Housing Research and Policy at the University of New South Wales and Associate Director at the New South Wales City Futures Research Centre. Hal is a leading housing expert, and he co-authored the books Housing Policy in Australia, A Case for System Reform, and The Private Rental Sector in Australia, Living with Uncertainty, published in 2020 and 2021. Who better to author this paper than Professor Hal Pawson? Joining him and also co-authoring this report, Andrew Clark, who is a lecturer in sociology and social policy at the University of New South Wales. His research expertise is in homelessness and housing insecurity, housing policy and social welfare. Andrew is currently conducting studies on the experience of applying and waiting for social housing in Australia and on the eviction of low-income tenants in the private rental market. Ryan Van Newland is a senior lecturer in the City Planning Program at UNSW in Sydney. His research focuses on the intersection of housing markets, planning regulations and infrastructure delivery, with particular focus on social equity outcomes. Ryan has recently taught urban management and planning at Western Sydney University and worked as a senior research officer at UNSW's City Futures Research Centre. Before joining academia, Ryan worked as a local government planner, and I am just so delighted that we have Hal, Andrew and Ryan here with us today. The conversation will predominantly be between Hal and I, but Andrew and Ryan will chime in as necessary. But we are absolutely so grateful to have this level of expertise and skill to advise us independently of what Queensland's housing crisis currently looks like. So I might just dive in. A few quick housekeeping things first. We are broadcasting in Zoom. we will be recording it for distribution later. You can ask questions throughout the session. We have some staff monitoring your questions. We've got so much to get through, and we do have lots of pre-submitted questions, so we're going to do our best to get to you. And I think that's all the housekeeping. So I think we'll jump into the questions. So as I mentioned, Hal, our community members are working all across Queensland, working with families who are living in cars and tents. They're seeing women and children who are unable to leave violent situations because there is nowhere safe to go. We already know that we're in a housing crisis, but what does this report actually tell us about the numbers behind the story that we're seeing every day?
Yeah, thanks very much, Amy. Well, I think graphically illustrated here, you can see that the social housing register, which is often used as a sort of benchmark for unmet need for this sort of housing, is really a pretty small, only captures a pretty small fraction of the unmet need for, even for social housing, let alone the unmet need for social and affordable housing. Now, those numbers, as it says on the legend to the graph, are census-based estimates. So my colleague Ryan, also on the call, is the author of this part of the report and the creator of this analysis, which uses 2021 census numbers. So what we're able to say with certainty is that there are about, in fact, 102,000 either homeless people or existing low-income renters who are in housing stress already, in rental stress, as recorded in the census, across Queensland, 5 times the number that are on the social housing register, including net of existing tenants. And if we sort of translate that to people, that probably means, and also look at the unmet need for social and affordable housing, that's people who, including some people there who are slightly higher up the income scale, that comes to over 150,000 existing. That's the existing need now. And we would translate that as around 300,000 people, which is a very large slab or very large slice of the Queensland overall population. And the final thing I'll just mention about this analysis, which we think is important and we hope the state government will take on board, is that the geography of the unmet need for social and affordable housing, as shown by the census analysis, we think is probably a better basis for calibrating the geography of investment in social and affordable housing than the social housing register itself, which clearly captures only a small fraction of the overall problem.
Thanks, Hal. And I guess, you know, we have another thing that we have observed as a sector is that there are a lot of women and children who require solutions from our services, people with disability, older women. What does your report tell us about the characteristics of the people who are within that 300,000 cohort that the report talks about?
Well, certainly the cohorts that you're talking about would be experiencing, there would be a much higher incidence of unmet social and affordable housing need for those groups than the population as a whole. But what I think the report does more, what it focuses on more is the geography of need, the geography of rents and the geography of rent changes. And what we're able to establish from that is not only that Queensland as a state has experienced significantly higher than Australia-wide average rent increases since the start of COVID. Not only that, but the geography of rent increases over a slightly longer period, going back to 2017, is quite uneven across the state. And the graphics that are on the screen just now are highlighting that there are epicenters of rising rents and also unmet need for social and affordable housing as well, particularly in the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, and in central Queensland.
And how Can you explain to us why Queensland in particular is feeling the housing crisis so acutely, and also whether you've got any explanation for why these particular regions are feeling it the most?
Well, I think a couple of possible reasons why it is that the Queensland situation looks more stressed than other states at the moment is that population growth has been faster in Queensland over the last few years. During a period when population has risen by 6% in Queensland, it's only 4% across the rest of Australia. And some of that is internal migration. Clearly, there was no international migration to Australia at all for 2 years. And that had a bigger effect on other states than it did on Queensland, because there were internal moves into Queensland as well. So that's one reason. Another reason why the state as a whole has got more concerning statistics on rents and on homelessness than other states is simply because it's regions generally across Australia, more than capital cities, which have really been in the eye of the storm over the last couple of years. Much more than I think for a long time. And Queensland is a state with a big regional population. Queensland's a state where regions are half the state, which is a much higher proportion than, let's say, New South Wales or Victoria, where capital city is a much bigger proportion. So those are a couple of reasons. You also asked about, well, why is the geography of need the way it is, or the way what affects the geography of need within the state? One of the factors there, I think, is that we're talking about coastal and resort areas, which we suspect, have experienced more stress on their rental market because of the withdrawal of long-term mainstream rental property and its redesignation as short-term rental, Airbnb or other platforms. And that is that Australia-wide, that's that isn't a massive effect. That doesn't have a massive effect on the rental market, but in certain parts of certain states, it definitely does. And I think the boom in domestic tourism over the last couple of years, except obviously when lockdowns were actually in force, during the 2 years of the sort of height of the COVID crisis, domestic tourism was booming because people want to go on holiday, but they can't get on the plane and go to another country. So I think it stands to reason that that's one of the aspects which has also influenced the geography. And the final one is the one that is really the explanation for all regions or many regions across Australia, not just in Queensland, experiencing increasing demand for housing during a period when there was no migration from the rest of the world. And that, I think, is the effect of the new lifestyles that people are able to enjoy when working from home has suddenly become something that's possible for large parts of the working population. And when you can work from home and don't need to go to the office ever, or at least every day, then the possibility of moving away from an expensive capital city to a place where you've got more amenity and probably cheaper housing that's a choice that's presented itself to a lot of people in the last 2 years, and a lot of people have taken that up.
Yeah, I found it really compelling the way that the report laid out different factors that are influencing the housing crisis, such as, for example, short-term rentals, but not sort of laying the blame at the feet of those things, but saying these are sort of exacerbating an existing sort of building crisis, which comes off the back of decades of inaction. And one of the things that really struck me in the report was the explanation that over the last decade in Queensland, we'd seen about 500 new social housing dwellings come online each year on average, and sort of that was around the same number as demolitions and sales. So we didn't, over the past decade, we haven't had that growing we haven't had a growth in our social housing stock to keep pace with a growing and changing population. And then on top of that, we've had these changes like because of COVID that have just sort of exacerbated or accelerated the crisis. And so I guess, we've got a sense now of what the crisis looks like and what the need looks like. But can you tell us a little bit about what we have in the market to sort of currently address that need?
Well, I think one of the additional factors that is a significant one in Queensland, more so than in some other states, is the extinction of the National Rental Affordability Scheme and the expiry of NRAS restrictions on rents, which the reason why it's a bigger issue in Queensland is because Queensland providers were more successful in at landing the NRAS incentives that were the funding for that scheme set up under the Rudd government. So that was all very good. That was all something to celebrate at the time for Queensland. But the downside of that is that when these 10-year periods expire, a state that has a disproportionate number is getting hit disproportionately hard. So up to 10,000 of those rent-restricted properties are exiting the sector or exiting that status at the moment, and that will. But it will be. It will. That's a process that will complete in 2026. After which, none of the NRAS-funded dwellings will continue to be rent restricted. Some of them will continue to be offered at a below market rent, but only the ones that are owned and managed by community housing. I don't think we can expect many private.
Yeah, Hal, we did have a pre-submitted question on that, which I might just give you now. So the person has said that they're concerned particularly about the NRAS scheme ending. And did you have any suggestions as to what could be done to sort of mitigate against the impact that that scheme ending will have in Queensland?
Well, I mean, to some extent, the Queensland government and the federal government's recent commitments to up their expenditure, up their investment in social and affordable housing, because we're really talking about affordable housing here. So, to some extent, those pledges that have already been made will help to offset that reduction, but it's not sufficient. And I think what's very very concerning is that the federal government, even since the change of party in power, doesn't, as far as we know, hasn't, as far as we know, collected the data which would really fully tie down the consequences of the ending of that program. And I think if they were to do that, it would probably be, maybe the reason why they haven't done it or don't want to do it is because there would then be questions would then arise. Okay, well, what are you going to do about that? So I think that's an area where we really should be demanding that the DSS, federal DSS, which manages the NRAS program, takes on the job of assessing, collecting the data, which is extremely easy for them to collect, to illustrate the consequences that the winding down of the program is going to have. So
how we think about the the need for more housing, and that's absolutely something that's made out very clearly in your report. But we also have, you've also made some clear recommendations related to increasing Commonwealth rent assistance, and the NRAS scheme as well is sort of a subsidy scheme. There was also some commentary in your report about whether particular housing products as opposed to supply of housing. So when I'm talking about products, it's really about financial assistance payments for things like bonds or to sustain tenancies. How far do those types of things get us as opposed to the other side, which is building more houses?
Well, certainly increasing the ability of low-income people to pay for housing will enable them to retain more post-housing income and the ability to afford other essentials of life a bit more easily. So it's absolutely no bad thing. There's a bit of a risk that increasing rent assistance, which is the main program which funds, which provides a boost to incomes of low-income people in the rental market. If you did that on a significant scale, some of that would probably be lost by rents simply increasing and absorbing some of that. We've researched this, and I think satisfied ourselves that it wouldn't be an issue across the whole market, but it would be in certain types of markets, the low value markets in particular. So that is a risk, particularly if you don't at the same time step up the supply of low cost housing as well. So really those two things need to be done in concert. And I think raising rent assistance is fine. It's highly desirable. And it will cushion the rental stress that some households are in. But the fundamental nature of private rental housing is it's insecure, and even with a proper elimination of no ground evictions, it still remains that doesn't fully create a security for tenants, because most campaigning demands for ending no grounds evictions don't oppose the idea that it's quite legitimate to end a tenancy where the purpose is to sell the property. I mean, our report suggests that maybe that shouldn't be allowed. Our report suggests that we ought to be discussing whether even sale of a property is a legitimate ground for ending a tenancy. That's not to say that we're saying that if you own a rental property, you will never be allowed to trade it unless the tenant leaves. What we're saying there is you can sell it, but you can only sell it when the buyer is also a landlord or someone who wishes to be a landlord, and they're willing to take on the tenancy that already exists in the property. Now, that may seem a bit way out, but unless you were to do that, then insecurity remains a fundamental part of being a private tenant in Australia. And even if it's affordable, it's still not secure. You're muted, Amy.
Goodness me. We are having some really fantastic questions coming through. So thanks to everyone for participating so actively. I've got two really topical things to ask you, Hal. And one is, the question about rental caps. So, we're talking about, I know in the report you talk about how, and you have just talked about how we make the private rental market more stable for tenants, given that we know that housing is going to be provided to people on low incomes by the private rental market into the future. Yeah. Do you think putting caps on increases to rent is part of the answer?
Well, I mean, we've recommended a variety of ways in which private rental regulation could be further strengthened, because to give government credit, there's already been one set of rental reforms in the last year or so, and fine, but they don't go far enough. And the particular issue, the most concerning issue, I think, is the exclusion of fixed-term tenancies as from the better protected situation that tenants otherwise have. So yeah, I mean, I think as far as the cap on rents is concerned, or that's one of the other things that we've floated in our recommendations, the idea that state governments, Queensland and others for that matter, should consider the possibility of limiting the amount of rent increase that a tenant can face during their tenancy at a period like, in a period like the one we're facing now, rent increases for advertised properties are far above the consumer price index. And that, I think, is a situation where a lot of existing tenants also will find themselves facing landlords coming to them and saying, well, I've seen that rents are going up very fast have gone up far above what you're paying for an equivalent property on the market for advertised properties. Therefore, you're going to need to pay $100 a week more yourself, even if that's 20% more than you've been paying already. Now, what we're suggesting there is that a limit to CPI or some other benchmark that puts a restriction on the ability of landlords to push up rents is extremely timely just at the moment. And it's very much to be welcomed that from what the Premier said in response to the media conference today, it's something that might even be considered by Queensland government.
Yeah, and we have another question that's come through in relation to the government's response today to your excellent work, Hal, and the work of your team, where she has said that there is potential for the state government to look at purchasing NRAS properties. What's your reaction to that? Well,
that's another interesting possibility. I think this has been sort of pushed back. Any such suggestions have been, although they've been made to the federal government by many, they've been pretty strongly rebutted. The federal government doesn't seem to even want to talk about it. So yeah, if the state itself thought that was something worth exploring, I'd say that's again something very much to be welcomed.
So how we've sort of wandered off into talking about the really important issues arising in the private rental market, but I just wanted to return us to thinking a bit more about the sort of different types of need that exist. And one of the really stark things that have come out of the report is the level of homelessness and the growth of people who are experiencing homelessness in Queensland. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the report found there and also how those findings were made?
Yeah, fine. Well, what this graph does is it combines a trend in a proxy for homelessness, which is the orange line, with the supply of homes becoming available to let in the social rental sector. And it's the kind of scissors graph of this. It's the contrary direction of travel of those two indices that I think is particularly worrying. So as far as homelessness itself is concerned, we're using here data from the AIHW, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which publishes stats on, which collects statistics from specialist homelessness services across Australia, and has done so for more than 10 years, and publishes a very informative analysis of the number of people getting assisted and the reasons they're assisted and the kinds of help they're given, and also the people who get turned away and don't, where the SHS can't help them because it's full up, doesn't have capacity. So what that line on the graph is showing you is the average monthly number of people benefiting from specialist homelessness services of one kind or another in Queensland, on the right-hand scale, significantly increasing from between from 11 to 14 or 13,500 over that period, which is a pretty rapid increase. It's a more rapid increase than homelessness service users across the whole of Australia, considerably more rapid, 22% compared with 8% in the last 4 years. But I think just to draw attention also to the blue bars, so what that's showing you is that the number of lettings available to or being made by the Queensland government and by community housing organisations and Indigenous housing providers in Australia, in Queensland, fell from around 7,000 5 years ago to almost only just over 5,000 last year. That's more worrying almost than rising homelessness. That the capacity of the system to house homeless people and others has been shrinking very fast across that time.
And so I guess that gets us to the point of, well, it sounds like we don't have enough houses for our current population, and we know we're going to experience more population growth. We also know that international migration is predicted to return to pre-pandemic levels this year. And so, Hal, what does your report tell us about where we're at in terms of the current stock and what we actually need to get us out of this mess?
Well, this presentation here, these bars are, I think, this is the most conservative way of presenting what is needed as compared to what is currently pledged. So the Queensland government has pledged 13,000 social and affordable homes to be added to the stock, or commenced probably, in the 10 years of the current housing strategy. That's 2017 to 27. So 1,300 is simply a division by 10. It's not that, no doubt it will be a bit variable from one year to another. But bear in mind that that is social and affordable rental. What we've done in two different ways, as shown in the two bars below, is we've estimated a minimum and a maximum estimate of the necessary new social housing, the additional social housing units needed to maintain the percentage of all housing that is social housing, or the representation of social housing in the whole market. Because population growth is continuing and no doubt will continue, simply maintaining a flat number of social housing properties that's what we've seen over the last 10 years. And the result of that is that the proportion is going down and down and down. So just to maintain that proportion, not to increase it, at its very low level, what is it, 3.4% of all housing at the moment? So just to maintain that proportion, bearing in mind expected population growth, you would need between 1,500 and 2,700 additional social housing units, compared to a number which is probably significantly below 1,300, because that includes some affordable as well. We don't unfortunately know how many affordable homes there are in that 13,000 that's committed by the state government over 10 years, because that's, like a lot of other what I think is pretty straightforward data, is not in the public domain. So admittedly, that 1,300 number predates the HAF. So the Queensland can quite legitimately expect a significant share of the Housing Australia Future Fund investment that the federal government is now proposing to commit over the next 5 years, assuming they can get their mechanism through Parliament, which is happening at the moment. So it should be a bit better than 1,300, assuming that some towards the end of the 2017 to 27 strategy, but we don't know by how much, and we also don't know how much this is in fact affordable rental housing, not social housing anyway.
And Hal, just as a point of clarification, when we talk about, because I think it's a really important distinction to make, and we do see the announcements a lot that government's saying that they're going to deliver X amount of houses, and combined they are social and affordable houses. What do you consider to be affordable housing, and what's the sort of definition that's used, working definition that's used for your report?
Yeah, good question, because these terms aren't, there isn't a sort of universal understanding of what they mean. Affordable rental housing, as we define it, would be a rental housing that is made available at a rent that is discounted to the market. So rather than being where the rent is set as a percentage of the occupying tenant's income, it's a housing where the rent is set at 75 or 80% of the market rent for an equivalent property in that locality. So yeah, that's a definition which, at least in some parts of Australia, is recognised, but it tends to be used or misused quite a lot as well.
It's definitely used differently in different contexts, and I'm not sure that we've seen a sort of clear definition applied to the current commitments, nor do we know which is social and which is affordable. So I guess we watch this space. How you talked a little bit before about the HAF, the Housing Australians Future Fund, which is a new initiative by the Albanese government. And I think last year, when the new Labor government was elected, the Anthony Albanese really used his identity as someone who grew up as social housing as sort of a way to put forward, talk about how he and his government would be prioritising housing policy. Can you talk us through a little bit about the things that have changed since we had a change of government federally?
Yeah, I mean, it is a refreshing change from where we were 1 year ago. We do at least have a federal government that has got some ambition in the housing area, a federal government that has already, I think, shown some ambition to lead and to coordinate and even to expand expenditure on investment. It's doing so it's expanding expenditure on investment in a, you might say, a slightly complicated or convoluted way by investing money into equities and then receiving a return from that, which is then used as a subsidy to enable social and affordable housing to be built. So, I mean, there's certainly a very much more positive contribution from the federal government than we were seeing, for a decade, really, up until last year. And it's part of a package as well. And I think this is very important that people are aware that it isn't that there's more to it. There's more to the federal Labor package than just the Housing Australia Future Fund. There's also some what I think are significant, important institutional reforms as well. The re-establishment of a National Housing Supply and Affordability Council to provide a kind of, semi-independent advisor on how much housing Australia needs or how much social and affordable housing it needs, and also Housing Australia being established as a national housing agency, which is a renaming of the existing NIFIC, but with some wider powers. And personally, I think the wider powers that are being offered are not sufficient, but at least I think that's a positive move. So the policy recommendations that we're suggesting here, well, back to you, Amy, and then I'll come back to this.
Hal, I was also going to sort of ask you about the Housing Accord and how important that is, bringing together the different levels of government, and sort of, if you could, before going into these recommendations, if we're just staying in the space of what is now, what do you see as, what is the importance of the Housing Accord, and how do you sort of delineate the role of the Commonwealth and then the state and even local governments in solving the crisis?
Well, I mean, the National Housing Accord was an agreement announced by Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, as part of the October budget last year. And it's something that wasn't just, here's another bit of what we promised in our election platform. It was not promised in the election platform. It was a new. So, and it was incorporating some of what was promised, but it was adding to it. So the headline aspiration of the National Housing Accord is that a collaborative effort between the federal government, state and territory governments, local government, and also, importantly, the community housing industry and institutional investors. All of those stakeholders have an input to make to this. And the aim is to ensure that 1 million homes are built, or I guess at least commenced, over a 5-year period. And all of these stakeholders who are party to the agreement will play some part in achieving that. Now, I mean, I think it's no bad thing. It's a million is actually not more. Australia did achieve 1 million over a 5-year period during the 2010s at one point, but we've slipped well below it already, and the current trajectory is very significantly downward. So expanding overall housing supply is no bad thing, and I wouldn't knock it at all. What I would say, though, is it is not a cure-all for housing unaffordability, and I'm afraid that there are some sort of siren voices which say that it is, and I'm afraid I don't buy it. And the report explains why we think that is a mistaken claim.
So Hal, I might get you then to talk a little bit about what those. Oh, I'm having some feedback. Hang on. Oh, sorry, I think we've fixed that. Sorry, everyone. Sorry to your ears. Yeah, I might get you to talk now, Hal, to some of those key recommendations that the report makes, particularly directed toward the Commonwealth Government.
So I'll quickly run through these. So the 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the left-hand side is a sort of way of that sort of typology of different issues, different concerns about the housing system, and what under which, like headings, under which we could suggest policy reform, policy initiatives, policy to be expanded from what it is at the moment. So enhancing housing policy making and housing governance, we're suggesting that a broadly scoped housing strategy framed by overarching goals is something which we need at the federal level, as well as at state level. And we do have the federal government committed to launching a national housing and homelessness plan. They like to use the word plan rather than strategy, but never mind. It's more or less the same thing, or it could be. And the re-establishment of a distinct housing entity within government, well, I think Housing Australia is what we hope that will be. So those two proposals or recommendations are, we believe, ongoing or emerging. Under meeting social housing need, we would recommend that the size of the Housing Australia Future Fund at the moment is not sufficient, and at the very least, it needs to be there needs to be a commitment to extend it beyond 5 years, after which it will be exhausted. And a permanent supportive housing funding framework is something that I think we developed the case for that in our earlier report called Australian Homelessness Monitor 2022, which is addressed at people chronic homelessness and the absence of a funding stream to pay for what in some cases is really necessary to be permanent support. That there are people at the sharpest end of that are people who won't cease to be in need of support after a short time, which is true, which would be true of most people, but not all. And that group, I think, need to be properly accommodated and supported. Under enhanced affordability and security for low-income private tenants, reforming rent assistance, I mentioned already, that's partly about spending probably more on it, but also targeting it better to need. And we're also suggesting that the federal government does have a role to play in facilitating build-to-rent development, even market build-to-rent, which doesn't directly address affordable housing at all. I totally appreciate that. But it could be a platform for a fraction of it to be affordable. And what's more, even if it isn't, I think it's a beneficial diversification of our rental housing system, and that will provide more choice for aspiring tenants, and also a contribution to overall housing supply. And finally, on this slide, housing policy settings that negatively impact broader housing affordability. We think that we're not at all original in saying that we think that private landlord tax concessions are a problem in our system. They are a problem because they're inequitable in terms of the distribution of benefits, which are very regressive and primarily benefit higher income earners, and they're a big problem because they also actually make housing more expensive, because those effective subsidies through negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount are capitalized into the value of housing.
Thanks for that, Hal. So there's been a few questions come through about these things in particular, and a bit of chat about the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. Whether you could talk a little bit more about the process that will surround that, and how people can influence that process most effectively, in your view.
I wish I knew the answer to that question, is all I can really say, because unfortunately, this is all still very much shrouded behind, government confidentiality. Very regrettably, in my opinion, the National Housing and Homelessness Plan is not part of the legislative package which is currently going through Parliament. Unlike Canada, which initiated a national housing strategy for the first time in its history in 2016, they legislated theirs. They declared in law what the purpose of the strategy was, and how it would be structured, and how it would be monitored, and how it would be governed. We haven't done that, or the Albanese government hasn't done that, and I'm a little bit worried that it may not be getting the priority which I think it ought to get, because if you want to fix this problem beyond some short-term fixes, which we probably do need, but that's not enough. This is a problem which has got structural causes which have been in the making for decades, and you need a meaningful long-term housing and homelessness strategy to address those issues. And so I actually don't know really very much more than that about what the remit of the strategy or the housing, the NHHP is, the breadth of it, or what the structure of it will be. I'm afraid we're still all in the dark on that.
Okay, so that's a bit of a watch this space. We also have a question in there about build to rent. So that's one of the recommendations that you've got on the screen there, Hal. And it would be great, I think, if you could explain a little bit more about what build to rent actually is, and how it could be part of the mix of making sure that there's actually security for people who are living in the private rental market.
Well, it's a term that's been imported from the UK, and a similar sort of product is a big part of the American housing system, where it's called multifamily housing. You could say it's a mainstream housing market version of student housing, purpose-built student housing. Purpose-built student housing is a product which is designed to be used for that purpose forever, and to be held in single ownership. And the financial case for investing in purpose-built student housing is that it generates a rental return. So it's something that's attractive to financial institutions which need to, especially sort of pension funds or super funds, that need to generate a reliable long-term return to pay out to their beneficiaries. So in Australia, though, until very, very recently, we really haven't seen this purpose-built student housing type model in the mainstream market. We are beginning to see that, and quite a lot of developers are waking up to the fact that this is something, a kind of product into which they could diversify their medium to high density construction activity. And that would be a way for them to probably become more insulated from the volatility of the Australian housing market, because the people who are investing in build to rent housing are not so influenced by the expectation or wanting to flog it off as soon as possible, or flog it off when it's appropriate or when it makes financial sense to do so, because their motivation is to hold and generate a long-term rental return. So the market price build to rent mainstream product that we are seeing beginning to come through, particularly in Melbourne, but also in some other parts of Australia, and in a small way in Queensland as well, Absolutely, admittedly, it's something which is targeted to the middle and upper part of the income spectrum. It's not, by its nature, an affordable housing product. It's a high quality housing product, but it's a product where security is inherently greater, I think, irrespective of legislation. It's a product where, as a tenant, provided you maintain your side of the rental contract, you can feel pretty secure there, which in most of the private rental market owned by mum and dad investors, that's not the case, because most individual investors are motivated by the capital value and the possibility of capital gain much more than they are by rental income. So the benefits that could flow through from this, which I think are indirect as far as affordable housing is concerned, include this, possibly kind of disruptor role of providing a much better rental product that hopefully makes the case for mum and dad investors to raise their game and manage their housing more professionally than perhaps we've known historically. And I think as for the housing market as a whole, it will provide, or it would provide, a greater diversity of choice for people who are needing to live in the rental market for some period of their lives, and increasingly large part of their lives for a lot of people, or even forever.
Yeah, and I think, how you're talking there broadly about the model, not necessarily the models that we've seen in Queensland. So it's not the case that build to rent has to deliver for the higher end of the market. Your report makes it clear that build to rent could actually deliver for people on lower incomes as well, which I think is
and the Queensland government is experimenting with that. To give credit where it's due, the Queensland government is experimenting with a couple of major developers already at making available a subsidy for a period of time, that in return for a commitment to reserve a part of those build to rent, primarily market build to rent schemes, to reserve a part of those schemes for rents being charged well below market rates for people who qualify under some specified rules.
Yeah, and I guess, again, it's about keeping a focus on what that affordable housing actually means in each context. So we're going to move to talk a bit about the state government now. And so particularly since 2019, we have seen the state government take some important strides forward in terms of addressing or responding to the housing crisis, and how the report talks to those. I'm wondering if you could outline them for us.
Thank you, Amy. Well, I think one of the things which the report, a very important part of the report, and this is actually Andrew, who's the author of this part of the report. We really make an effort to do a stock take on existing policy settings in the Queensland housing system, particularly around social housing, affordable housing, and homelessness, and the private rental system as well. And coming out of that stock take, that chapter in the report, these are some highlights of aspects of reform or of commitments to stepped up expenditure, which the Queensland government has committed to in the last 3 or 4 years. And that's something which we certainly shouldn't ignore. These things are to be commended, really. So the sort of headline number that the Queensland government talk about in terms of expanding investment is that nearly 4 billion is the sort of total number. Some of that, half of that though, is in fact invested in a future fund that will generate annual returns. So something very similar to the half, and in fact it came before the half. That's been the size of that fund has been doubled recently when the Premier called her Housing Affordability Summit in October. The government doubled the size of that from 1 billion to 2 billion. So that's expected to generate about $130 million per year, which will be available as a housing subsidy to enable providers to invest in social affordable housing. The remainder, the rest of the other 2 billion, is a direct investment, is on the balance sheet as opposed to being off the balance sheet, which is what the future fund the way that the Future Fund works in accounting terms. And I already mentioned that there's a phase of rental regulation reforms that's already gone through, which has strengthened minimum standards, allowed pet ownership as a default, and partially enhanced tenant security, but not wholly, as I explained a bit earlier. And there's been an effort to diversify housing assistance, to broaden the number of people who can possibly be helped, even though the amount of social housing available, at the moment is still vastly inadequate. And finally, a community housing capacity building fund of $5 million, which is quite a recent commitment that again is very welcome, because the sector in Queensland is quite underdeveloped compared to some of the other states anyway, and I think a bit of a leg up there would be well placed.
And so, Hal, what do you think? So, yes, I think it is really important to acknowledge that there have been some positive steps forward. What do you consider to be the key things that you think the state government could do now to improve the situation in Queensland?
Okay, well, again, I'm using the same headings as before, under the enhancing housing policy making and governance. I think the next Queensland housing strategy could be a big improvement, I hope, on the current one. Not to say the current one is meaningless, but it's really not. It doesn't have the qualities of a strategy. I think it doesn't commit sufficiently. It doesn't have a strong enough analytical base. We also think that the transparency of government activity is woefully inadequate in terms of the social and affordable housing statistics that are routinely published by government. Very good that the housing register is published once a year, but starts, completions, demolitions, and sales, those are very basic numbers that we think ought to be published separately for social and affordable housing, just as a routine thing. And that would enable us to, without that, government isn't accountable, can't be accountable. So in terms of meeting social housing need, we think that, much that it's impressive that the government has recently doubled the size of the QIF, maybe there's more possible, maybe that could even go further. Having said that, I think it is the federal government that's much more obliged to be the main funder of new social and affordable housing. I think it's very commendable that Queensland and Victoria in particular have stepped forward as states and said we will fund social and affordable housing in a way that we never did historically. So that's all very good. But anyway, there's a consideration about possibly expanding even further the existing future fund. Phasing in meaningful inclusionary zoning. Now, this is a model or a mechanism which we think is really astonishing that it's ignored. They put the potential for state and territory governments to use their planning powers to generate affordable housing, social possibly, but certainly affordable rental housing at no cost to government by mandating a contribution from private developers as a part of the standard development approval process. This is not pie in the sky. This does exist already in Australia in a small way, in the city of Sydney primarily, and in other countries in a big way. And it really, the Queensland government certainly toyed with the idea and spoken about considering it, but it's more than considering that we need that to be introduced. We need, I think, mandating affordable housing to be a part of other land disposals, not just those which are owned or formerly occupied by public housing. And the permanent supportive housing funding framework I mentioned a bit earlier, rental regulation, I think I've talked about already. Look at the scope for short-term rental regulation so that these parts of Queensland, which have been really hammered because so much housing is being withdrawn from the mainstream market and reducing supply effectively, that needs to be looked at. Build to rent, another state government could do more in that space as well as the federal government, and is already to some extent. And finally, this is a much bigger picture one. A phased replacement of stamp duty with the broad-based land tax. That's a kind of very widely supported policy proposal by many land and other economists in Australia, and other states have considered, or even the ACT case already doing that. But and New South Wales to a limited degree as well. This is something which the Queensland government needs to address as well, or consider, I think.
And Hal, I think we've ended on an awesome note, because I feel like we could probably now do an hour on the tax reform that could help to address the housing crisis, both at a Commonwealth and state level. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to say thank you so much for the incredible work that you and Andrew and Ryan have done to produce the Pawson report. It is available on our website for everyone to download, use and share. It's an incredibly important piece of work. I want to thank our incredible Town of Nowhere partners for supporting the work, Tenants Queensland and the Services Union. If you've been inspired by today's conversation and want to be more involved in QCOSS's Town of Nowhere campaign, please do jump online and become a supporter. In addition to that, if you represent an organisation and would like to become one of our founding partners, there is always time to do that. And please get in touch with us at campaigns@qcoss.org.au. Next Tuesday, I'll be attending the Premier's Housing Roundtable, and we will be taking this report into that meeting and continuing to fight for our vision of a Queensland where every Queenslander has a roof over their head by 2032. Thanks so much for everyone's support. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.